So, uh, reading the Bible straight from the Old Testament into the New Testament is, well, it's kind of like watching a movie sequel where you somehow just, missed an entire multi-season spin-off TV series.
Oh, totally. Like you skipped a whole boxed set of DVDs or something.
Right. Because think about the visual contrast here. You're sitting there and you finish the very last pages of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
The book of Malachi.
Yeah, exactly.
And the Jewish people are living under this massive Persian empire. They're speaking Hebrew. Things are, they're relatively settled. The temple is functioning, and the prophetic voices have just sort of faded out into this silence. And then you turn a single page. You literally just start the Gospel of Matthew, and suddenly there were Roman centurions marching through the streets.
Right, the Romans are just everywhere.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
And everyone is speaking Greek. Plus, you've got these intense competing religious factions like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they're just screaming at each other.
It's absolute historical whiplash.
It really is. You're left wondering, wait, who are these guys? Like, what happened to the Persians? And where on earth did all these Romans come from?
Well, you turn one thin piece of paper, but you're actually skipping over a chasm of about 400 years.
400 years.
Yeah. And that missing spin-off series is exactly what we are exploring with you today. We're taking a custom-tailored deep dive into this fascinating set of source materials, specifically the EDU 105 lecture notes on the Intertestamental Period.
So our mission today is to look at this massive gap. Because, the notes refer to this era as the 400 silent years.
Right.
Which, on the surface, makes it sound like everyone just took a really long historical nap.
Yeah, it sounds super boring. But Protestants traditionally used that label because there were no recognized canonical prophets speaking on behalf of God during this time.
Oh, okay. The canonical prophets.
Exactly. But as we unpack these lecture notes, we're going to show you why those quote-unquote silent years were actually the loudest, most chaotic, and arguably the most crucial centuries in ancient history. So not a nap at all.
Not even close. It was an absolute pressure cooker. They manufactured the exact cultural, political, and linguistic conditions that made the world of the New Testament even possible.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how we actually get to that New Testament world, the notes say we have to start with a massive cultural earthquake.
Oh, a huge one.
Right, the Persian peace that you leave behind at the end of the Old Testament gets completely shattered by a guy who, well, he really lived up to his historical title, Alexander the Great.
Yeah, he definitely earned the great part.
Starting around 332 BC, he just sweeps through the Mediterranean. But looking at the sources, he wasn't just, conquering territory and planting flags. He was bringing this absolute tsunami of Greek culture.
The historical term for this process is Hellenization.
Right.
And Alexander wasn't just interested in owning your land, he wanted to export his entire lifestyle.
Right.
So he spread Greek philosophy, Greek architecture, and crucially, the Greek language, specifically Koine Greek.
Koine Greek. Yeah, which very quickly became the common everyday tongue of the entire known world. It was basically the ancient equivalent of modern globalization.
So was it just a linguistic shift? Like people learning a second language for trade? Or was it more than that?
Oh, way more. It was a fundamental clash of worldviews. And it really forced traditional cultures into a corner.
And the lecture notes highlight one specific cultural import that caused absolute chaos in Jerusalem, which is the Greek gymnasium.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets really intense.
Right, because when you hear gymnasium today, you probably picture, treadmills, fluorescent lights, people aggressively lifting weights.
Sweaty locker rooms.
Exactly. But the Greek gymnasium was the epicenter of education, philosophy, and athletics. It was essentially the ancient equivalent of an Ivy League university mixed with an exclusive country club.
That's a great way to put it.
And the most shocking part for the local culture, Greek athletes competed and trained completely naked.
Literally completely naked.
Yeah, they worshiped the perfection of the human form.
So you really have to imagine the psychological shock of this. You have an ancient Jewish culture that's built on a sacred covenant, strict adherence to the Torah, and a really deep emphasis on physical modesty. And suddenly that collides with this glamorous imperial culture that celebrates the individual, the intellect, and the naked physical body.
It must have created an immediate generational rift.
Oh, it tore families apart. You had traditionalist parents terrified of losing their heritage, and then you had Jewish teenagers who just, they wanted to be part of the dominant, quote-unquote, cool culture.
The pressure to assimilate must have been immense.
Unbelievable pressure.
And the sources outline how divided the response was. I mean, some people tried to walk the middle line, kind of selective integration. Some completely resisted. But then you have the extreme end of assimilation.
Yeah, the accommodationists.
Right. The notes mention that some Jewish men who wanted to fit into this elite Greek athletic culture actually underwent primitive, agonizing surgeries to reverse their circumcisions.
Which is just wild to think about.
I know. They were that desperate to hide their Jewish identity in the gymnasium.
And that visceral detail, I mean, it really underscores the socioeconomic reality. If you wanted power, if you wanted to be part of the ruling class, you had to be Greek.
You had to fit in.
Exactly. And this cultural tension simmered for over a century until it finally reached an absolute breaking point in 167 BC.
Okay, set the stage for us there.
So at this point, Alexander's empire had long since shattered into pieces. One of those pieces was the Seleucid Empire, which controlled the region around Syria and Judea. And the Seleucid king at the time was a man named Antiochus V Epiphanes.
Antiochus V. And according to the notes, Antiochus decides that, well, passive cultural pressure isn't working fast enough. So he escalates it into brutal, state-sponsored religious persecution.
Yeah, he just goes all in.
He issues decrees completely banning Torah observance. He outlaws the Sabbath, outlaws circumcision. He makes possessing a Torah scroll a literal capital offense.
Which is basically trying to legislate Judaism out of existence.
Right. But I have to ask why. Was Antiochus really just a religious fanatic trying to stamp out a rival faith? Or was he using cultural assimilation as a brutal tool for political control?
It's the latter. The historical context reveals a much more pragmatic and really cynical motivation.
Pragmatic how?
While Antiochus was facing humiliating military defeats from a new, rising superpower in the West, Rome.
Ah, okay. The Romans are entering the chat.
Exactly. And because of these defeats, he was under massive financial pressure to pay war indemnities. He needed a unified, compliant empire to maintain absolute political control so he could extract revenue.
Got it. So the Jews were a problem for his bottom line.
Right. To him, the traditionalist Jews were this rebellious, unassimilated pocket in his empire. Forced Hellenization was his brutal tool for ensuring political loyalty.
And he pushes it to the ultimate extreme. I mean, he goes right to the heart of Jewish identity, the temple in Jerusalem.
Yeah, this is the tipping point.
He desecrates it by erecting an altar to the Greek god Zeus, and he forces the sacrifice of pigs on the holy altar.
Which is just the ultimate taboo.
The ultimate taboo. It is the spark that ignites the powder keg.
He tragically miscalculated the resolve of the people he was oppressing. I mean, this horrific desecration sparked the legendary Maccabean revolt.
Right. The Maccabees?
Yeah. An older priest named Mattathias basically decides he would rather die than offer a pagan sacrifice, so he and his sons flee to the hills.
And his most famous son is Judas Maccabeus, whose nickname literally translates to the Hammer, which is amazing.
It's such a great historical nickname.
It really is. So they launched this brilliant, desperate guerrilla warfare campaign in the Judean hills against the massive professional Seleucid army.
And against all conceivable odds, they actually win.
It's incredible. In 164 BC, they recapture the temple, purify it, and rededicate it, which, by the way, is the historical origin of the festival of Hanukkah.
Right, it's a stunning victory. They threw off an empire and eventually established full Jewish independence under a new line of rulers known as the Hasmonean dynasty.
Hasmone.
Yeah. And for a brief moment, it really looked like they had won the culture war.
But looking at the timeline in the lecture notes, history has a funny way of ruining a good victory.
Oh, always.
Because these Hasmonean rulers, they start out as pious rebels fighting for religious freedom. But give it a few generations, and they become the exact thing they fought against.
They get completely compromised.
Right. They decide to combine political kingship with the role of the high priest, something that strictly violated traditional Jewish law, which kept the throne and the altar separate.
Exactly.
So they become incredibly wealthy, worldly, and deeply corrupt.
And this internal corruption is the catalyst for everything that follows. I mean, when you combine the unceasing pressure of the surrounding Greek world with the sudden realization that your own leaders are deeply compromised, it creates a massive cultural identity crisis. The everyday people look at the temple leadership and realize the system is completely broken.
And this crisis basically splinters Judaism into competing sects.
Right. Each with a different survival strategy. And this is exactly where those famous groups you meet in the New Testament come from.
Okay, let's walk through these factions. Because looking at the lecture notes, they're basically 4 different psychological responses to a cultural apocalypse. It's like 4 different survival
I
strategies.
love that framing.
Right. Because if the leadership is corrupt, how do you react? Well, let's look at the elites first.
Yeah.
The Sadducees.
The Sadducees. They were the wealthy aristocratic class. They basically controlled the temple establishment.
Okay.
And their strategy was essentially to collaborate with whoever was in charge just to maintain the status quo, which eventually meant working very closely with the new Roman occupiers.
Sell out to new management.
Basically, yeah. But what is fascinating is the socio-economic logic behind their theology. They only accepted the written Torah, and they explicitly denied the existence of the afterlife, angels, and the resurrection.
Which makes perfect sense when you think about it.
Right.
If you are already rich, powerful, and sitting at the top of the social pyramid, you don't need a cosmic afterlife to balance the scales of justice.
Yeah, not at all.
You want your reward right now. You want to preserve the current world order.
Precisely. But then contrast that with the Pharisees. They were the popular leaders of the common people.
The folks who are actually suffering.
Exactly. The people who were suffering under oppressive taxes and corrupt leaders. They needed a theology of the afterlife and resurrection to ensure ultimate justice.
Right.
The name Pharisee essentially means separated ones. And their strategy for surviving the cultural crisis was to build a legal fortress.
The notes call it building a hedge around the Torah.
A hedge.
They believed in both the written law and this massive body of oral tradition. Their logic was kind of like, the nation was exiled before because we broke God's laws.
Okay.
So if we can just obey every single law perfectly, down to the tiniest detail of ritual purity, God will finally intervene and save us.
Right, so you have the Sadducees compromising for power and the Pharisees building this wall of extreme legalism.
And that leads us to a third group. The guys who looked at both of them decided the entire society was hopelessly polluted and essentially rage quit civilization.
The Essenes.
The Essenes. They are the ultimate off-the-grid preppers.
Totally. They head out into the desolate wilderness and set up this strict, celibate, communal isolation in places like Qumran, near the Dead Sea.
Right.
They practice extreme ritual purity, taking multiple ritual baths a day. They completely reject the Jerusalem temple as corrupt. They're basically just sitting out in the desert, writing furiously, waiting for an apocalyptic cosmic battle between the forces of light and darkness.
Wow. And if you didn't want to hide in the desert and you didn't want to just obey rules, there was a fourth option, right?
The violent resistance. The Zealots.
The Zealots.
Yeah, these were revolutionary nationalists who believed God was the only true king of Israel.
So to them, paying taxes to Rome wasn't just an economic burden.
No, it was literal idolatry. They used guerrilla warfare, and they even had this extremist faction called the Sicarii, or Daggermen.
Daggermen.
Yeah, they would conceal blades in their cloaks and just assassinate political collaborators in crowded public spaces.
That is wild. So when you open the New Testament, Jesus is walking directly into the middle of this exact 4-way intersection.
Exactly. Compromise, legalism, isolation, and violent rebellion.
But what I find truly fascinating in these lecture notes is that these intense debates over Jewish identity didn't just happen with daggers in the streets.
Yeah.
They sparked a massive literary explosion.
Oh, absolutely massive.
You mentioned earlier that Protestants call this period the Silent Years. But based on the sheer volume of writing produced during the Second Temple period, it was anything but silent. I mean, people were writing constantly to defend their worldview.
Yeah, the output really forces us to rethink how we understand the boundaries of ancient literature. For instance, the lecture notes detail a collection of writings known as the Apocrypha, or deuterocanonical books. These include essential historical accounts of the Maccabean Revolt, but also powerful narratives and survival literature.
Like the Book of Judith, which is mentioned in the notes.
Oh, Judith is fascinating.
It has an incredibly intense plot. It's this gripping survival story featuring really strong feminist themes. You have this brave, pious Jewish widow who uses her beauty and wit to infiltrate the camp of an invading Assyrian general, gets him drunk, and then literally decapitates him with his own sword to save her people.
It's brutal.
It is, but it's a story designed to give hope to a population that's constantly under threat of being wiped out.
Exactly.
Mm.
And while Protestants do not include books like Judith or the books of Maccabees in their biblical canon, they consider them useful for history but not divinely inspired, the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions do include them.
Okay, so that's the Apocrypha. But the notes also introduce an even stranger category of writings,
Yeah.
the pseudepigrapha,
Right, which literally translates to false writings.
meaning they were written by an anonymous author who just slapped the name of an ancient famous hero on the cover to give it authority.
Yeah, it was a common practice back then.
And the standout text here is 1 Enoch. I was looking at the summary of this, and it reads like ancient cosmic horror.
It really does.
It expands on these brief verses in Genesis to describe fallen angels called the Watchers coming to Earth, mating with human women, and creating monstrous giants called the Nephilim.
It's intense.
Super intense. It's full of wild, psychedelic, apocalyptic visions, and it heavily develops the concept of the Son of Man, this divine figure who will judge the earth.
The imagery in First Enoch is intensely weird to modern readers, but it was incredibly popular and influential in the first century. It provided a framework for understanding why the world was so full of evil and suffering.
It blamed cosmic, demonic forces.
Exactly, forces that had corrupted the earth.
Okay, wait, here's where it gets really interesting, and I need to push back on this idea of canonical boundary.
Okay, go for it.
If books like 1 Enoch or the Apocrypha aren't in the standard Protestant Bible, why do they matter to you, the listener? I mean, didn't New Testament writers actually read, use, and quote this stuff?
Oh, they definitely did. That's a very perceptive challenge.
Because doesn't the New Testament book of Jude literally quote 1 Enoch directly to make a theological point?
Mm.
It feels like we are deliberately ignoring the source code of the New Testament if we ignore these books.
You're absolutely right. Jude quotes 1 Enoch, and the New Testament writers constantly engage with the theological vocabulary developed in these texts. Concepts of resurrection, angelology, demonology, and apocalyptic expectation.
So why were they cut out?
Well, the reason they were eventually excluded by Protestant reformers centuries later was largely due to a desire to return to the strict Hebrew canon recognized by Rabbinic Judaism, which rejected these later Greek and apocalyptic texts.
Interesting.
But whether you consider them inspired scripture or not, the lecture notes make it clear. You cannot fully understand the mind of a first-century person without understanding the literature they were reading.
And we can't talk about this literature without touching on the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century.
Right. Discovered by a shepherd boy in 1947 in those caves near Qumran. Almost 900 manuscripts preserved by that off-the-grid desert group, the Essenes. And they prove the astonishing accuracy of how the Hebrew Bible was copied and transmitted over thousands of years. But the notes argue there was another text, a translation, that had a far more immediate impact on the spread of early Christianity than the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes, the Septuagint, often abbreviated as the LXX.
The Greek's translation.
Right. This was the monumental effort to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. According to legend, 72 Jewish scholars translated it in exactly 72 days in Alexandria, Egypt.
72 scholars in 72 days.
That's the legend. The reality was a much more gradual process spanning decades, but the impact is just staggering. By translating ancient Hebrew into the modern Greek of the Empire, it permanently bridged the Jewish and Hellenistic worlds.
And the notes point out that when the New Testament authors quote the Old Testament, they aren't translating from Hebrew. They're usually quoting the Greek Septuagint directly.
Exactly.
And we need to explain how that translation process actually changed theological meanings, because the classic example in the notes is Isaiah 7.14.
Oh, this is a perfect example.
The original Hebrew word used was Alma, which generally just means young woman.
Right.
But when the scholars translated it into the Septuagint, they chose the specific Greek word Parthenos, which explicitly means virgin.
Yes.
That single, subtle translation choice made centuries earlier became the foundational proof text for the Christian understanding of the virgin birth.
It really highlights how linguistic shifts shape theology, which honestly brings us to the ultimate synthesis of these lecture notes.
Let's hear it.
All of these chaotic, seemingly disconnected threads we've discussed. The Greek cultural tsunami under Alexander, the brutal persecutions, the splintering of Judaism into rival sects, the explosion of new literature, the translation of the Septuagint, and finally, the conquest of Jerusalem by the Roman general Pompey in 63 BC.
Right.
None of this was just random historical noise.
No, it was entirely constructive. The Apostle Paul later looks back at this exact alignment of history and calls it the fullness of time.
The fullness of time.
Yeah, it's the idea that all this chaos was actually weaving the exact infrastructure needed for a new religion to launch globally. So let's look at how the mechanics of this actually work, starting with the linguistics.
Oh, the linguistic prep.
Thanks to Alexander the Great violently spreading Hellenism centuries earlier, Koine Greek was spoken everywhere from Egypt to Italy. So when early Christian missionaries started preaching, there was no translation barrier.
Right. A single letter could be understood across the known world.
Exactly. Then you have the political infrastructure.
Yeah.
Rome. They conquered the Mediterranean with brutal efficiency. But in doing so, they established the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, they wiped out piracy on the seas, and more importantly, they engineered thousands of miles of incredible stone roads.
This is my favorite part of the notes.
I know, it's so cool. Think of the Roman roads like the ancient version of laying fiber optic cables.
Yes.
Rome spent a fortune building this massive network exclusively to march their military legions around to crush rebellions. But ironically, those exact same military roads became the superhighways that early Christian missionaries used to travel safely and rapidly.
Spreading viral theological messages across the empire.
Exactly. Add in the universal Roman law that gave legal protections to citizens like Paul, and Rome literally paved the way for its own eventual religious transformation.
And finally, there was the religious infrastructure.
Right.
Because of the various exiles, deportations, and the economic pressures of the Hellenistic era, the Jewish people had scattered all across the Roman Empire, a demographic shift known as the diaspora.
The diaspora.
And wherever they settled, they couldn't access the temple in Jerusalem. So they built local meeting houses called synagogues.
And these synagogues were essentially ready-made launch pads. I mean, when a missionary arrived in a new, entirely pagan Roman city, they didn't have to stand in a public square and try to explain the concept of one God from scratch.
No, they went straight to the local synagogue.
Exactly. There was already a built-in audience gathering every week who understood monotheism, who had the Greek Septuagint ready to read, and who were actively waiting for a Messiah based on the literature of those 400 years.
The profound historical irony here is just unmistakable. The very empires that sought to crush or control the Jewish people ended up providing the exact tools required to spread their worldview globally.
It fundamentally changes how you view this era.
It really does.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? If you ever feel like you're in a quote-unquote silent period in your own life, your career, or your studies, maybe it's actually an infrastructure building phase. It's the pause before the symphony's climax. You literally cannot understand the New Testament without understanding the psychological pressure of those Greek gymnasiums.
Or the desperate guerrilla warfare of the Maccabees.
Or the theological arguments between the wealthy Sadducees and the legalistic Pharisees.
And the quiet scholars translating Hebrew into Greek.
Right. It's all connected.
It is. And it raises a deeply provocative question about resilience. I actually want to leave you with a final thought to mull over based on these sources.
Oh, let's hear it.
Consider that Jewish synagogue system we just mentioned. In 70 AD, just a few decades after the events of the Gospels, the Romans completely destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem.
A total tragedy.
Right. Now, in the ancient world, the temple was the absolute center of reality. When a culture's temple fell, the sacrificial system ended, and the religion almost always died out entirely.
But Judaism didn't.
No. Because of those 400 supposedly silent years, the Jewish people had been violently forced by earlier exiles in the diaspora to invent local synagogues, places centered purely on reading and debating the word rather than offering animal sacrifices.
Wow.
So their religion was unexpectedly perfectly adapted to survive without a geographic center. Did the absolute worst tragedies in their history actually force them to build the very mechanism that ensured their survival to this day?
That is an incredible thought. The tragedy built the lifeboat.
Exactly.
Well, so next time you read the Bible and you flip from the Old Testament to the New, don't just gloss over that blank page in between. Remember the massive, violent, innovative spin-off series you missed. Because that blank page is hiding the most dramatic infrastructure building 400 years in human history.